With her own hands, Eleanor buried her husband under Montana's silent rain. Her eyes, as empty as the winter horizon, no longer expected anything from life. But fate has rough and warm hands like those of Silas Boone, a stranger who came to repair not only broken fences, but broken hearts. Between whispers and shared fears, between scars that speak without words, life is reborn like the apple trees they planted together, deep roots that sustain the miracle of a new family. If this story touched your heart, leave your like as one. Lights a window to guide someone home in the storm, and tell us, how do you think this love story born from the ashes will end? Your experience is the missing chapter in our shared story. Chapter 1. Earth and Silence. The cold Montana wind caressed the freshly turned soil as Eleanor Hartley stood motionless before the grave. Her hands, toughened by years of farm work, still retained traces of that earth beneath her nails, the same earth that now covered Charles's body. The chestnut locks that escaped from her bun danced around her pale face, framing eyes that seemed emptied of everything except a resigned stillness. The cemetery was empty now. No one had remained after the brief service, as if death were contagious and everyone was in a hurry to distance themselves from its domain. The headstone, modest and hastily carved, offered only a name and 2 dates that compressed 46 years of existence into a simple dash. "I buried you with my own hands, Charles," Eleanor whispered to the wind, "as I promised I would." The words dissolved in the afternoon air, mixing with the dust that floated in the golden light of sunset. Montana, 1874. A still wild territory, where death by tuberculosis was just another way to depart, as common as the changing seasons. Eleanor knelt and placed a small pocket watch on the fresh earth. It hadn't worked for years, but Charles had never wanted to part with it. "Time stopped at some point," he used to say between coughing fits, "but we keep moving forward." Now time had definitely stopped for him, while for her it continued its relentless march. As she rose, her eyes scanned the horizon where mountains drew bluish silhouettes against the sky. That land, her land, stretched before her like a sea of grass and unfulfilled promises. The small farm they had built together, the wooden house that Charles had expanded 3 times, the leaning barn he always promised to repair next spring. All of it was now solely hers, an inheritance of half-built dreams and complete debts. The sun was beginning to descend when she finally turned away. Her steps on the dry grass produced a rhythmic crackling, as if the earth reminded her that she was still alive, that there was still a road to travel. At 43, Eleanor Hartley had buried not only a husband, but also 3 children who never made it to birth. Life in the territory did not forgive weakness. In the distance, the house stood against the twilight, as solitary as herself. The windows, dark like closed eyes, seemed to await her return. Eleanor pressed against her chest the letter that had arrived that morning, the paper already wrinkled by the pressure of her fingers. The written words burned through the fabric of her black dress. Public auction, debt settlement, 2 days. Night was falling over Montana as Eleanor crossed the threshold of a house that perhaps would soon cease to belong to her. Create novel translation text, marked down with her own hands, a complete English translation. With her own hands, Chapter 2, the auction. The town's central square bustled with activity under the harsh morning sun. Eleanor observed from her cart the movement of hats and dresses, the exchange of glances and whispers that were interrupted when someone noticed her presence. 2 days after Charles's burial, the entire town seemed to have gathered for the spectacle, the forced auction of the widow Hartley's possessions. Her belongings, furniture patiently carved during the long winter nights, the crockery she had brought from Pennsylvania, even the swing that Charles had built for the children who never arrived, were displayed in the center of the square like the remains of a shipwreck. Eleanor felt each gaze like a small dagger. There were neighbors who for years had shared her table and now examined her possessions with the barely disguised greed of those seeking a good deal. "We'll start with the main property," announced the auctioneer, a man in a dark suit with a metallic voice. "The Hartley farm, 60 acres, main house, barn and well. The debts amount to $900. Does anyone offer $600 to start?" Eleanor pressed her lips together. The property was worth at least 3 times that. but everyone knew that a childless widow had no chance of keeping it. Judge Wainwright, seated in the front row with his impeccable black frock coat, observed her with a mixture of pity and barely contained satisfaction. It had been he who had accelerated the collection process after Charles's death. $650, offered the store owner, avoiding looking at her directly. $700, countered another man. Eleanor felt the hair becoming denser, each breath requiring more effort. She watched as her life crumbled figure by figure, how each bid took her further from the land where she had buried not only her husband, but also her dreams. It was then that she saw him. A tall man was making his way through the crowd. He wore a leather coat weathered by the dust of the roads and a several-day beard that failed to hide the firmness of his jaw. His eyes, of an almost transparent blue, contrasted with his sun-tanned skin. He stopped at the edge of the circle of spectators, observing the scene with a stillness that caught Eleanor's attention. He wasn't from town. She had never seen him before. The bids continued to rise as the stranger slowly advanced, until he positioned himself right in front of the auctioneer. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate and contained, that suggested a man accustomed to calculating every gesture. The crowd gradually fell silent upon noticing his presence. $850, someone was saying when the stranger raised his hand. $1,000. His voice was deep, like stones rolling at the bottom of a river. For the widow Hartley to keep her house and her land. An absolute silence fell over the square. The auctioneer blinked, confused. Sir, the auction is to settle debts, not to... $1,000, repeated the man, extracting from his pocket a wad of worn bills, enough to cover the debts and for her to keep what is hers. Eleanor felt her heart had stopped. Judge Wainwright had stood up, his face reddened by indignation. This is irregular. The law states that debts must be paid, interrupted the stranger without raising his voice, but with such firmness that the judge fell silent. It says nothing about taking everything from a widow who has just buried her husband. The murmur spread among those present as the stranger deposited the money in the auctioneer's hands. Then, ignoring the looks and whispers, he approached the cart where Eleanor remained motionless. Silas Boone, he introduced himself, briefly removing his hat. A woman who buried her husband with her own hands and still came to face this pack deserves to keep what is hers. Their eyes met for an instant, and Eleanor felt an inexplicable recognition, as if this man understood the exact weight of the pain she carried. It wasn't compassion she saw in his gaze, but something deeper and rarer, respect. As the stranger, Silas, moved away through the crowd that parted at his passage, Eleanor Hartley understood that something fundamental had changed in the script of her life. She didn't know if for better or worse, but for the first time in many days she felt she could breathe fully. Chapter 3. The Stranger. The first light of dawn filtered through the worn curtains when Eleanor heard the sound. Steady, rhythmic, unmistakable. Someone was hammering wood. She got up from the bed where she had barely managed to fall asleep, her senses alert like those of a wild animal. From the small window of her room, she could see the barn, and there he was. Silas Boone worked methodically, replacing rotted boards from the structure with new pieces of wood he must have brought with him. His coat hung from a nail, and his rolled-up shirt revealed muscular forearms marked by old scars. He worked with the absolute concentration of someone accustomed to solitude, without wasting a single movement. Eleanor dressed hurriedly and went out to the porch. The morning was cool, with that cold that precedes the relentless heat of summer days in Montana. She observed the man in silence for several minutes before speaking. "I don't recall asking you to fix my barn, Mr. Boone." He didn't seem surprised by her presence. He continued hammering for a moment longer before turning to her. In the morning light, his face showed lines of experience she hadn't noticed during the auction. "You didn't ask," he responded simply, while selecting another nail from those he held between his lips. "Why are you doing it, then?" Silas considered the question while aligning a board. "Because it's broken," he said finally, as if that were explanation enough. Eleanor crossed her arms, studying him. Next to the barn were sacks of flour, coffee, beans, and other provisions, also new tools and more wood than was needed to repair the barn. "I can't pay you," she stated frankly. "Neither for the repairs nor for the supplies." Silas drove in the last nail before responding. "I'm not charging." A silence fell between them, interrupted only by the singing of birds and the distant mooing of cows in the pasture. "Mr. Boone, I appreciate what you did at the auction, but I don't need charity." He looked at her then directly, and Eleanor felt the weight of eyes that seemed to have seen too much. "I don't offer charity, Mrs. Hartley. I offer justice, perhaps." He wiped his hands on his pants and approached, maintaining a respectful distance. "I've seen how communities pounce on widows like vultures on carrion," he continued, his voice low but clear. "The same ones who shake the husband's hand in church on Sundays are the first to try to snatch the land from his widow." There was something in his tone, a combination of bitterness and first-hand knowledge, that made Eleanor wonder what personal history fed those words. "I have freshly made coffee," she said finally, an offering of truce. "And I can prepare something to eat." Silas nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. When Eleanor turned toward the house, she noticed that he stopped to wash his hands in the rain barrel and removed his hat before following her. Small gestures of respect that did not go unnoticed. The kitchen was the heart of the Hartley house, with its large oak table and the cast-iron stove that Charles had bought on their second anniversary. Eleanor served coffee in 2 unmatched cups and placed a plate with bread and butter on the table. She observed how Silas held the cup between his large hands, as if seeking the warmth as much as the flavor. "Where do you come from, Mr. Boone?" she finally asked. He took a sip before responding. "From everywhere and nowhere lately." There was a particular cadence in his way of speaking, as if he measured each word. "I was born in Pennsylvania. Then there was the war, the Civil War." Eleanor didn't need to ask which side he had fought on. Montana had been Union territory. "Family?" she asked, and immediately knew by the shadow that crossed his face that she had touched a wound. "I had a wife." "A son," he responded after a silence. "Not anymore." The simplicity of the phrase contained a world of pain that Eleanor recognized all too well. She didn't ask more. Instead, she told him about the farm, the most urgent work, the cows that needed attention, and the well that threatened to collapse. She spoke like someone reciting a to-do list, but both understood that she was offering him a purpose, something to occupy his hands and mind. When they finished eating, Silas got up and put his hat back on. "I'll start with the well," he said. "Then I'll check the north fence." Eleanor nodded. There was no need for more words. As she watched him walk away toward the yard, she understood that a silent pact had just been established between them. She didn't know how long it would last or what it meant exactly, but for the first time since Charles's death, she felt that the future was not merely a dark precipice before her feet. Chapter 4. Whispers and Prejudices. The small store in Rivers Bend was the epicenter of the town's social life. Between sacks of flour and cans of preserves were exchanged not only coins, but also the stories and rumors that wove the fragile network of the community. Eleanor felt the gazes fixed on her back as she selected the few items she could afford. 3 weeks had passed since Silas Boone's arrival at her property, and the whispers had grown like weeds after the rain. "Good morning, Eleanor," greeted Abigail Stokes, the proprietress of the establishment, a widow like herself but who had inherited the business from her late husband. "How is everything at the farm?" There was genuine kindness in her voice, rare oasis in the desert of hypocrisy that Eleanor had learned to navigate. "The fences are repaired, the well reinforced," she responded, aware of the ears that sharpened around her. "Mr. Boone has been of great help." "I'm glad to hear it." Abigail lowered her voice as she wrapped the purchases. "Although not everyone is so glad, I'm afraid." Eleanor nodded slightly. She didn't need explanations. The previous Sunday, in the small wooden church, Reverend Williams had dedicated an especially passionate sermon to the importance of maintaining appearances and avoiding situations that might give rise to gossip, all while staring fixedly at the bench where she sat alone, as she had every Sunday since Charles's death. "People need something to talk about," Eleanor responded, with a calmness she didn't feel. "If it wasn't this, it would be something else." Abigail placed a small box of tea on the counter. "This is on the house," she said, ignoring Eleanor's protest. "It's herbal tea. It helps with sleep." The gesture, small but significant, stirred something within Eleanor. It was easy to forget, amid so much judgment, that disinterested kindness also existed. Upon leaving the store, the midday sun greeted her with its relentless heat. She crossed the main street, deliberately ignoring the groups of women who interrupted their conversation to observe her. It was then that she saw Judge Wainwright leaving his office, accompanied by 2 members of the town council. His gaze briefly crossed with Eleanor's, and she could read in his eyes something more than disapproval. There was determination, as if he had made a decision. The road back to the farm wound between gentle hills covered with yellowish grass. Eleanor drove the cart with steady hands, letting the constant rhythm of the wheels on the earth pace her thoughts. In the distance, the silhouette of her property began to take shape against the horizon. From that distance, she could see Silas, working on the barn roof, his figure outlined against the Montana sky. During those weeks, they had established a routine based on shared work and mutual respect. They spoke little, but when they did, their conversations had the comforting quality of the authentic. Fragments of their previous lives occasionally emerged, like pieces of a shipwreck reaching the shore. Silas had fought at Gettysburg, had been given up for dead, and when he returned to his home found that his wife had remarried, believing him deceased. His son, barely 3 years old when he left for war, called another man father. "I stayed in the same town for 2 years," he had told her one night as they shared a simple dinner, "watching them from a distance, living like a ghost in my own life." "Why didn't you reclaim your place?" Eleanor had asked. Silas's answer had come after a long silence. Because she was smiling again, he was too. The boy had a father who didn't wake up screaming in the middle of the night. That night, Eleanor had understood that Silas Boone was a man defined not by what he took, but by what he had chosen to let go. Upon arriving at the farm, she found a small object carved in wood on the kitchen table, a bird with outstretched wings, so detailed that it seemed about to take flight. It was beautiful, with that imperfect beauty of things created by human hands. Next to the figure was a note written in firm but somewhat awkward handwriting. "For the difficult days, birds always find their way home." Eleanor caressed the polished surface of the small sculpture, feeling beneath her fingers the hours of patient work it contained. She placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, where the evening light reached it and seemed to give it life. That night, when Silas returned from checking the cattle, Eleanor had prepared a more abundant stew than usual. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that is only possible between people who have begun to understand each other beyond words. "Tomorrow I'll go to town for more nails," Silas commented as he helped clear the table. "The barn. Roof needs more work than I thought." Eleanor nodded, hesitating a moment before speaking. "Be careful in town. Judge Wainwright didn't seem happy today." Silas looked at her with those clear eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "Men like Wainwright are rarely happy when things don't go according to their plans," he responded calmly. "Don't worry. About me, Eleanor. I've dealt with worse judges than him." It was the first time he had called her by her first name, and the sound of those 4 syllables in his deep voice produced an unexpected warmth in her chest. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor contemplated the wooden bird illuminated by the lamp's light, a hand-carved symbol, a message without words. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to think of the future as something more than an exercise in survival. Chapter 5. Confessions at Dusk. The twilight painted the sky with violet and orange hues when Eleanor found Silas sitting on the back porch, carving a new piece of wood with his knife. His movements were precise, almost meditative, revealing years of practice in that portable art he could carry with him on the roads. She sat beside him in silence, offering him a cup of coffee that he accepted with a nod. The crickets were beginning their nightly concert, and in the distance, the cattle moved lazily toward the barn. It was one of those moments suspended in time that seemed to contain all the peace the world could offer. "What are you carving?" Eleanor finally asked. Silas turned the piece between his fingers. It was just beginning to take shape. but the silhouette of a horse could be discerned. "I don't know yet," he replied with a half-smile. "The wood has its own idea of what it wants to be. I just help it find it." Eleanor observed his hands, strong and rough, capable both of lifting heavy beams and creating something as delicate as the bird that now adorned her mantle. "My father carved," she commented, surprising herself by sharing that memory. "Small animals for my sister and me. He said each piece of wood already contained a creature. You just had to free it." Silas nodded as if he understood perfectly. Wise men think alike, regardless of where they were born. Silence settled between them again, comfortable as an old blanket. Eleanor contemplated the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "This arrived today," she said, extracting a crumpled envelope from her pocket. "It's a summons to appear before the town council. Apparently there is concern about my moral situation." She pronounced the last part with a tone that mixed irony. "And weariness." Silas stopped carving, his face hardening almost imperceptibly. "Wainwright," he murmured, not as a question but as a confirmation. "It seems a widow cannot allow a man to work on her property without arousing the indignation of the pure souls of the town." A gust of wind shook the branches of the old oak that shaded the house, producing a whisper that seemed to mimic the murmurings of the town. "It's not the first time I've faced something like this," Eleanor continued, surprised by her own frankness. "When we moved here 8 years ago, Charles fell ill the first winter. I had to take charge of everything. The cattle, the repairs. I even had to negotiate the sale of our harvest." She paused, reliving those days. The women of the town decided it was improper for a wife to assume masculine roles. Reverend Williams called me aside after the service to suggest that perhaps I should consider selling the farm and moving in with some relative. Silas listened with absolute attention, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that, instead of making her uncomfortable, encouraged her to continue. "I told them that my place was beside my husband, on our land." Eleanor's voice acquired firmness. As she remembered, Charles recovered that spring, and for a time the gossip ceased, until he fell ill again, this time not to recover. The shadows lengthened around them, and the temperature began to drop. Eleanor wrapped herself more tightly in her shawl, not only for the external cold. "What will you do with the summons?" Silas finally asked. Eleanor contemplated the paper in her hand. "Present myself, of course. I won't give them the pleasure of treating me like a fugitive." Silas nodded, silently approving her determination. Then, surprising her, he extended his rough hand and covered hers for a brief instant. "You're not doing this out of pity, are you?" Eleanor suddenly asked, needing to hear the answer, although she already intuited what it would be. The fading light drew deep shadows on Silas's face when he responded, "No, Eleanor. I do it because I felt rage." His voice was low but clear. "Rage at seeing an entire town that watched you bury Charles with your own hands and didn't lift a finger to help you, and then, barely was the body cold, they pounced on what remained of your life like scavengers." The rawness of his words resonated with the truth that Eleanor had felt, but had not allowed herself to express. "I've seen too much cruelty disguised as righteousness," Silas continued. "Men who quote scripture while snatching land from those who cannot defend it. Entire communities that turn away when one of their own suffers." He stopped, as if surprised by his own outburst. Then, in a softer tone, he added, "Long ago I decided that if I couldn't reclaim my own life, at least I would do what I could to prevent others from losing theirs." In the growing darkness, Eleanor studied the profile of that man. He wasn't handsome, in the conventional sense, but there was in him a quiet strength, an integrity that was more attractive than any superficial beauty. "We should give this place a name," she said suddenly. "Every farm in the territory has a name except ours. Charles never decided on one." Silas looked at her with curiosity. "What name would you like?" Eleanor contemplated the land that stretched. Before them, the fields they had worked, the home they had defended. "Deep Roots," she responded with certainty, "because that's what we're doing, isn't it? Taking root, refusing to be uprooted." A smile, the first real smile Eleanor had seen from him, transformed Silas's face. "Deep Roots," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "I like it." They remained seated on the porch until darkness was complete, sharing the silence and determination. The next day they would face the town and its prejudices, But that night, under Montana's starry mantle, they had planted something that no municipal council could uproot. Chapter 6. The Value of a Name. The small white wooden church had been transformed for the occasion. The pews, normally arranged in orderly rows facing the pulpit, had been reorganized in a semicircle. In the center, a table where Judge Wainwright presided with solemn air, flanked by Reverend Williams and 2 members of the town council. Before them, a solitary chair awaited Eleanor. The building was packed. It seemed that all of Riversbend had come to witness the spectacle of the moral hearing of the widow Hartley. Eleanor entered with her head held high, her black dress, the same she had worn at Charles's funeral, clean and perfectly pressed. Silas followed her at a short distance, his presence silent like a protective shadow. The murmur of conversations ceased abruptly when Eleanor took her seat in the designated chair. From there she could see every face in town, some embarrassed, avoiding her gaze, others openly curious. A few, like Abigail Stokes, with expressions of barely disguised support. This hearing has been convened to address matters concerning moral conduct and the welfare of our community, began Judge Wainwright in a pompous voice. Specifically, the situation of Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, who has been housing an unmarried man on her property without proper supervision or the blessing of this community. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on Wainwright, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. The judge continued, listing concerns about her situation: a woman alone, the constant presence of a stranger, the inevitable rumors such a situation generated, and the dangerous example it represented for the young women of the town. Appearances, Mrs. Hartley, he concluded in a sententious tone, are as important as actions themselves. When the judge finished his exposition, a thick silence fell. Eleanor breathed deeply before speaking. Judge Wainwright, reverend neighbors, her voice was clear and firm, I appreciate your concern for my soul and my reputation. However, I wonder where this concern was when I dug my husband's grave. Where was it when I had to bury him alone because no one in this Christian town offered to help me? An uncomfortable murmur ran through the assembly. Eleanor continued, Mr. Boone has worked on my property repairing what needed repair. He has slept in the barn, not in my house. He has shown more respect and decency than many who now sit to judge me. Reverend Williams cleared his throat. No one questions Mr. Boone's intentions, Eleanor. It is the situation itself that is inappropriate. Inappropriate. Eleanor's voice acquired a dangerous edge. Do you know what's inappropriate, Reverend? That a community that calls itself Christian allows one of its own to lose everything she has 2 days after burying her husband. Before the Reverend could respond, a voice rose from the back of the room. Eleanor cared for my Martha when she had the fever last winter. It was Thomas Jensen, a farmer whose wife had been gravely ill. She spent 3 nights without sleep, preparing cold compresses and cooking broth. She didn't charge a penny. A brief silence followed this intervention, broken almost immediately by another voice. When my Robert died of cholera, no one wanted to touch him, an older woman spoke. From a corner, Eleanor came and prepared him for burial. She washed his body and dressed him with dignity. One by one, members of the community began to stand up. A midwife recalled how Eleanor had assisted in difficult births without asking anything in return. A young man mentioned that the Hartleys had given him work when he arrived in the territory, with nothing but the clothes on his back. Testimonies of small acts of kindness, of solidarity, of simple humanity that Eleanor had sown over the years, without expecting recognition. Judge Wainwright seemed increasingly uncomfortable. This was not what he had planned. Finally, he struck the table with his gavel to restore order. No one questions Mrs. Hartley's character, he declared with irritation. It is the current situation that concerns us. Social conventions exist for a reason, and conventions don't feed the hungry or bury the dead. Silas's voice resounded for the first time, cutting off the judge's speech. All eyes turned to him as he advanced to stand beside Eleanor. His presence, calm but powerful, filled the space. I have known many communities like this, he continued, places where the appearance of goodness matters more than goodness itself, where a torn dress causes more scandal than a broken heart. His words fell like stones in stagnant water, creating ripples of discomfort. If you want to talk about morality—" Silas breathed deeply, looking first at Eleanor and then at the rest of the assembly. "Then know that I intend to marry this woman. Today. Right now." A collective gasp ran through the church. Eleanor looked at Silas with amazement, but in her eyes there was no surprise but a silent question. He held her gaze, and in that wordless exchange, Eleanor found her answer. "I agree," she said, standing beside Silas. Judge Wainwright seemed to have swallowed something bitter. "This is irregular. Such a decision cannot be taken lightly, and are you, as a representative of the law, refusing to officiate a legal union between two free and conscious adults?" Silas asked in a deliberately innocent tone. The judge found himself trapped in his own snare. To refuse would be to contradict the very moral argument he had used to convene the hearing. "Very well," he finally conceded with rigidity. "If that is your decision—" "It is," Eleanor confirmed, her voice firm. And so, in an improvised but no less solemn ceremony, Eleanor Hartley and Silas Boone were united in marriage before the community of Riversbend. Reverend Williams, after a resigned look at the judge, pronounced the corresponding blessings. When Silas placed on Eleanor's finger a simple ring that he had taken from his pocket, a silver band with a small engraving of leaves, those present understood that this had not been an impulsive decision, but something both had considered. D.T. The conclusion of the ceremony, Abigail Stokes was the first to approach to congratulate them, gradually followed by other members of the community. Judge Wainwright, defeated on his own ground, withdrew with what dignity he could muster. As they left the church into the evening light, Eleanor felt Silas's hand lightly brushing hers, a contact as light as a bird's wing, but equally significant. "You sure?" he asked in a low voice when they were far from other ears. Eleanor contemplated the ring on her finger. It wasn't the impulse of the moment that had guided her decision, but the recognition of something that had been growing between them day by day, like a tree that extends its roots underground, invisible but undeniable. "Yes," she responded simply. "Deep Roots needs a name at the entrance. Boone is a good name." For the first time she saw Silas smile fully, without reservations, and the effect transformed his weathered face, revealing the man he might have been in another life, one without wars or losses. They returned together to the farm, now officially theirs, both of them, under a sky that was beginning to fill with stars. Eleanor thought of Charles, of how life continued weaving its unpredictable pattern. She had not forgotten, not replaced what she once had. She had simply found against all odds a new path to move forward. And as night fell over Montana, the small house of Deep Roots shone with its own light in the darkness, like a beacon that signaled not just a refuge, but a new beginning. Chapter 7. Shared land summer advanced over Montana with its characteristic intensity. The days lengthened almost to midnight with the last rays of sun, and the heat made the horizon ripple as if the landscape itself breathed. Life at Deep Roots had acquired a new rhythm, one marked by shared work and comfortable silences. Eleanor. And Silas moved around the property with the unconscious coordination of those who have learned to read each other's intentions without the need for words. He rose before dawn to tend to the cattle. She had coffee ready when he returned. They worked together in the garden, their hands occasionally meeting among the tomato plants or while picking green beans. In the afternoons, when the heat became unbearable, they sought the shade of the porch, where Silas carved wood and Eleanor reviewed the farm's account books. The transition from two solitary lives to a shared one had not been without adjustments. Silas, accustomed to years of wandering, sometimes disappeared for hours, walking the boundaries of the property like a wild animal that needs to confirm the edges of its territory. Eleanor, used to handling everything herself, had to remember that she now had someone with whom to share decisions. And then there was intimacy, that unknown territory that both explored with the caution of those who have known loss. The first nights, Silas had insisted on sleeping in the barn, despite his official status as husband. "A signed paper doesn't change what we are," he had said. Eleanor had appreciated that respect, that absence of presumption. It was she who, 2 weeks after the wedding, invited him into the house. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Simply one night while they were having dinner, Eleanor said, "The back room is ready. It has its own entrance. I thought you might prefer it to the barn." Silas had looked up from his plate, studying her with those clear eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. Eleanor had nodded, holding his gaze. "It's your house too, Silas." That night, the silence between their adjoining rooms had vibrated, with unexpressed possibilities, with a mutual awareness that didn't demand to be named. When finally, days later, the boundaries between those spaces dissolved, it was with the naturalness of rain that finally falls after weeks of promising clouds. Now, in the fullness of summer, Eleanor worked in the kitchen preparing preserves for winter. The heat from the stove intensified the already stifling temperature, and thick drops of sweat slid down her neck as she filled glass jars with tomatoes and peppers. Through the open window, she could see Silas repairing the cartwheel, his movements, precise and economical, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. A sudden dizziness forced her to lean on the table. Lately, these episodes had become frequent. At first, she had attributed them to the heat, to the intensity of the work, but a suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. At 43, after 3 lost pregnancies with Charles, Eleanor had assumed that certain paths were closed to her. However, her body seemed to be sending her signals she couldn't ignore. She breathed deeply and continued with her task, determined not to get ahead of events. Time would confirm or deny her suspicions. Meanwhile, there was work to do, a life to build on the foundation that she and Silas were establishing day by day. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Silas entered the kitchen carrying a heavy sack. "I found this in town," he said, placing it on the table. Eleanor opened the sack to discover seeds, not just any seeds, but a variety of cold-resistant apple tree that Charles had wanted to plant for years without ever getting the right seeds. "How did you get them?" she asked, surprised. Silas shrugged with that modesty that characterized him. "Abigail Stokes had a contact in Helena. It cost me some money and a carved wooden horse for her granddaughter." Eleanor held the seeds in her palm, feeling their weight and potential. Planting trees was an act of faith in the future, a declaration of intentions. The apple trees would take years to bear fruit, years that demanded permanence, commitment, to the land and to each other. "We'll plant them tomorrow," she decided, "on the south slope where there's more sun." Silas nodded, and in his gaze Eleanor recognized the same understanding. They were setting in motion something that would transcend them, that would continue growing long after they were gone. That night, seated on the porch as the first stars appeared in the sky, Eleanor decided to share her suspicions. "I think I might be pregnant." She said it without preamble, with the same simplicity with which she would comment on a change in the weather. Silas, who was carving a new figure, stopped his hands. For a long moment, he remained completely still, as if fearing that any movement might break the fragility of the moment. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. "Not entirely," Eleanor responded. "But there are signs. The fatigue, the dizziness, changes in my body." Silas carefully set aside the wood and knife. With deliberate movements, he wiped his hands on his pants before extending one toward her. He didn't touch her, simply offered it, palm up, in the space between their chairs. An offering, not a demand. Eleanor placed her hand on his and felt how Silas's rough fingers gently closed around hers. "When I was in the war," he said after a silence, "I made a deal with myself. If I survived, if I returned, I would never again take the life of any living being. I had taken enough." He paused, his gaze lost in the darkened horizon. "When I came back and found my family transformed, I thought it was fair. That it was the price for the lives I had taken." Eleanor squeezed his hand, offering a silent presence as he navigated turbulent waters. "I never imagined I would have another chance to create life instead of destroying it." He continued, his voice firm despite the contained emotion. "To plant something that grows, be they trees or—" He left the phrase unfinished, but his eyes, as they turned to her, contained a mixture of fear and hope, so pure that Eleanor felt something expanding within her chest. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "I've lost 3 before, and now I'm older." Silas nodded, understanding. "I'm afraid too," he admitted, "of not being enough, of failing again." The honesty of his confession, the shared vulnerability, created between them a new kind of intimacy, deeper than any physical contact. "Then we'll be afraid together," Eleanor declared, "and we'll do the best we can, day by day." Under Montana's starry mantle, their interlaced hands sealed a new pact. Not a promise of guaranteed success or happiness, but of presence, of mutual support in the face of whatever might come. Summer advanced toward its culmination, and at Deep Roots, life followed its unpredictable course, like the streams that are born in the mountains and find their way to unknown valleys. Chapter 8. The weight of promises. Autumn came to Montana with its palette of ochres and golds, transforming the fields into an undulating sea of warm hues. The mornings dawned covered in frost, a reminder that winter was waiting its turn to claim the territory. At Deep Roots, preparations for the cold season occupied every available hour of light. Eleanor, in her 5th month of pregnancy, moved with a new cadence. Her belly, still modest but definitely present, preceded her like a silent announcement of the future growing within her. The morning sickness had subsided, replaced by a voracious appetite and an energy that surprised even those who knew her. The news of her condition had spread through River's Bend like wildfire through dry prairie. To Eleanor's surprise, the town's response had been mostly positive. Women who before barely greeted her now appeared at her door with home remedies for swollen feet and unsolicited advice. Abigail Stokes had knitted a blanket as soft as a cloud. Even Reverend Williams had offered a special blessing during the Sunday service. Only Judge Wainwright maintained his cold distance, though he no longer dared to openly show his disapproval. Public opinion had definitely tilted in favor of the Boones, and the judge was above all a practical man. On an especially crisp morning, Eleanor worked in the kitchen, preparing bread and listening to the rhythmic sound of Silas's axe splitting. Wood for winter. A figure on the road caught her attention. A rider was approaching the property, his silhouette outlined against the morning sun. As he approached, Eleanor recognized the son of River's Bend's telegrapher. The young man dismounted in front of the house, visibly nervous as he handed Silas a yellowish envelope. Eleanor watched from the window as her husband read the message, how his posture changed, tensing imperceptibly. When the boy left, Silas remained motionless in the yard, his gaze fixed on the paper in his hands. "Bad news?" Eleanor asked when he finally entered the kitchen. Silas carefully folded the telegram before responding. "My former regiment comrade, James Holloway, is ill. His wife says he doesn't have much time left and has asked to see me." "Where is he?" "In a town called Silverdale, near the border with Canada, about 5 days on horseback from here." Eleanor felt a pang of apprehension. 5 days there, which meant at least 2 weeks of absence in total. Winter was approaching, and with it, the most dangerous season in Montana. "You must go," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Silas looked at her, indecision clearly visible on his face, a rarity in a man habitually decisive. "Winter is close. There's much to do here." "And you?" "I'm fine," Eleanor assured. "The baby and I are healthy. We have sufficient provisions, the cattle are sheltered, and the most urgent repairs are already done." She approached him and, in an unusual gesture for her, took his hands in hers. "Silas, if this man is dying and has asked to see you, there must be an important reason." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on their joined hands. "James and I served together for 3 years. He saved my life at Gettysburg when they gave me up for dead. He carried me from the battlefield on his back, under enemy fire." The simplicity with which he related what must have been a traumatic episode was typical of Silas, but Eleanor had learned to read between the lines, to listen to what he didn't say as much as what he expressed. "Then you owe him this," she concluded. "Go. Deep Roots will still be here when you return." The decision was made. Silas would depart at dawn the next day. That night, as they prepared what was necessary for the journey, Eleanor felt an unease she couldn't fully express. It wasn't just the practical concern about staying alone during her pregnancy, but something deeper, the fear that this trip would awaken in Silas the old impulse to wander, to not put down roots anywhere. It had surprised her how, in just a few months, her life had intertwined with his, to the point that the idea of returning to solitude seemed almost unbearable. It wasn't dependence, she told herself, but the natural recognition that together they had built something valuable, something that deserved to be protected. "I'll be back before the first heavy snow," Silas promised that night, as they lay together, in the darkness. "You have my word." Eleanor nodded against his chest, listening to the steady beating of his heart. "Will you bring me something from the north?" she asked, trying to lighten the moment. "What would you like?" she thought for a moment. "Surprise me. Something that reminds me you thought of us while you were away." Silas held her tighter, and in that embrace was a more eloquent promise than any word. The morning of departure dawned with a thick fog that enveloped deep roots like a protective mantle. Eleanor prepared an abundant breakfast and packed sufficient provisions for the journey. While Silas saddled his horse, she wrote a letter for the dying friend, a message from a stranger who thanked him for having saved the life of the man who was now her husband and the father of her unborn child. "For James," she said, handing him the sealed envelope. "If it arrives in time." Silas carefully stored it in his saddlebag. Then, from his pocket, he extracted a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "I was going to give it to you when I returned, but perhaps it's better you have it now." Eleanor unwrapped the handkerchief to find a small wooden figurine, a pregnant woman, with hands resting on her rounded belly. The carving was exquisite, capturing an expression of serenity and strength in the tiny face. "I've been making it at night," Silas explained, "so you don't feel alone while I'm gone." Eleanor caressed the small figure, feeling beneath her fingers each careful cut of Silas's knife, each hour of patient work. "It's beautiful," she murmured, emotion strangling her voice. Silas mounted his horse, a robust chestnut that he had bought specifically for the journey. From the saddle he seemed taller, more reminiscent of the wanderer who had arrived in her life months ago. But his eyes, as he looked at her, contained something that stranger did not possess: belonging. "Take care of our roots," he said, adjusting his hat. "I'll return soon." Eleanor nodded, the small wooden figure clutched in her fist like a talisman. "We'll be waiting." She watched him move away down the road until his silhouette merged with the morning mist. Only then did she allow the tears, contained until that moment, to flow freely down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but the simple recognition of how much her life had changed, of how much she had allowed herself to feel again after years of resigned solitude. She returned to the empty house, placed the figurine on the mantel next to the carved bird, and prepared to face the days ahead. There was work to do, a home to maintain, and a future that continued to grow inside her, with or without Silas present. Autumn advanced inexorably toward winter, and in Montana, the seasons waited for no one. Chapter 9. The countdown days transformed into weeks with the slowness characteristic of late autumn. Eleanor kept the farm running with the methodical efficiency that had always characterized her, but the nights grew longer in her solitude. She had acquired the habit of talking to the small wooden figure Silas had carved, telling it the day's events, sharing thoughts she had no one to exchange with. "Today the baby moved so much it seemed to be dancing," she told it while preparing bread in the kitchen. "I wonder if it will be restless like its father." The third week since Silas's departure brought the first snowfalls, still light, barely, a reminder of what was to come. Eleanor observed the sky with growing concern. In Montana, winter gave no warnings. It arrived suddenly, burying roads and isolating farms for weeks on end. Abigail Stokes had taken to visiting deep roots every few days, bringing news from town and welcome company. "Winter will come early this year," she commented during one of her visits, as they shared tea by the fireplace. "The pines are loaded with cones and the foxes already have their winter fur. These are signs that never fail." Eleanor nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her increasingly prominent belly. Silas promised to return before the first heavy snow. Abigail observed her with that mixture of affection and concern, characteristic of someone who has lived long enough to know that not all promises can be kept, no matter how sincere the intention. Men make promises thinking they can bend the world to their will, she said softly, but nature follows its own course. That night, after Abigail left, Eleanor found herself reviewing the provisions again, and again counting sacks of flour and jars of preserves, as if in those numbers she could find some certainty. The baby moved restlessly, perhaps responding to her own anxiety. "Your father will return," she whispered, caressing her belly. "He has travelled more difficult roads to get here." The days continued to pass. The snow became more frequent, though still not intense enough to block the roads. Each morning Eleanor went out to the porch and scrutinized the horizon, looking for the familiar silhouette of a rider. One afternoon, while tending to the chickens, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. Her heart leaped as she hurried to the front of the house, a smile involuntarily forming on her face. But it wasn't Silas who was approaching, but Judge Wainwright, mounted on his black horse. "Mrs. Boone," the judge greeted formally, dismounting in front of her. "Judge Wainwright," Eleanor responded, hiding her disappointment. "What brings you here in this weather?" The man seemed uncomfortable, adjusting his leather gloves with excessive meticulousness. "Official matters, I'm afraid," he said finally. "I've received news that might be of interest to you." Something in his tone made Eleanor tense. The judge continued. "A telegram arrived yesterday from Silverdale. It seems there was an incident, a brawl in the local tavern, gunshots." The world seemed to stop around Eleanor. The cold of the incipient winter seeped into her bones as she tried to process the words. "Silas?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "The telegram mentions a man named Boone wounded during the altercation." Wainwright extracted a paper from his jacket. "There are no more details. I'm sorry." Eleanor took the telegram with trembling hands. It was brief, brutally concise. Altercation, Silver Tavern. Man identified as S. Boone wounded. Condition unknown. "When did this arrive?" she asked, struggling to maintain her composure. "Yesterday afternoon," the judge responded. "I considered it my duty to bring it to you personally." Eleanor nodded mechanically, her mind working at full speed. Silverdale was 5 days away on horseback, at best with good weather and clear roads, but with the snow beginning to accumulate. "I need to go there," she declared, more to herself than to Wainwright. The judge looked at her, as if she had lost her mind. "Mrs. Boone, you are pregnant. 6 months? Winter is about to close the roads and Silverdale is beyond the mountains. It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible when it comes to the life of someone you love," Eleanor responded with a firmness that surprised the judge. Wainwright sighed, removing his hat in an unusually humble gesture. "I understand your concern, but you must think of your child. If your husband is wounded, the last thing he needs is for you and the baby to be in danger trying to reach him." As much as it pained her to admit it, Eleanor knew the judge was right. In her condition, undertaking such a journey would be a recklessness that could cost 3 lives instead of saving 1. "Could you send a telegram?" she asked, "to know more?" Of course, Wainwright nodded. "I'll do it myself upon returning to town, and if there's news, I'll have it brought to you immediately." When the judge left, Eleanor returned to the house. That suddenly seemed too big, too empty. The fire in the fireplace continued burning, indifferent to the news that had just upset her world. On the mantel, the figurine carved by Silas seemed to observe her with its small wooden eyes. She sat by the fire, the telegram still in her hand, and for the first time since Charles's death she allowed herself to cry openly. They were not tears of resignation, but of frustration, of impotence in the face of forces she could not control. The distance, the weather, her own body that anchored her to deep roots while her heart pulled her toward the north. When the tears were exhausted, Eleanor rose with renewed determination. She could not undertake the journey, but neither would she wait passively. She took paper and pen and began to write frenetically. Letters to the sheriff of Silverdale, to the local doctor, to the owner of the tavern where the incident had occurred. She would ask the judge to send them all, and if Silas could not return, to her at least her voice would reach him. That night, as the snow fell with increasing intensity, Eleanor placed a lit lamp in the window facing the road. A light in the darkness, A silent promise. Here is a home waiting for you, find your way back. The following days passed in a haze of activity and waiting. Judge Wainwright, showing an unexpectedly compassionate facet, daily sent his son with news from the telegraph. But the messages that arrived were frustrating in their vagueness. Wounded man in recovery, conditions stable but delicate, storms blocking roads to the south. A week after the initial telegram, an unprecedented snowstorm hit the territory. For 3 days the wind howled around Deep Roots like a wounded animal, and the snow accumulated until it covered half the windows. Eleanor kept the fire burning day and night, and continued placing the lamp in the window, although she knew that no traveller could advance in those conditions. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm abated, leaving behind a transformed world, a whitish landscape where familiar contours had softened until becoming almost unrecognizable. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing a stew when she heard the sound, a crunching in the snow, different from the noise of the wind or the branches, laden with ice. She looked out the window and saw him, a dark figure laboriously making its way along the snowy road. He wasn't riding a horse, but walking with difficulty, leaning on what appeared to be an improvised cane. Despite the distance and the snow that blurred the outlines, Eleanor immediately recognized Silas. She ran out to the porch, forgetting to put on a coat, barely feeling the cutting cold as she made her way through the snow to the road. As she approached, she could see that Silas was limping notably. His face, partially covered by a scarf, showed signs of extreme exhaustion. When they finally met in the middle of the snowy road, words were unnecessary. Eleanor simply clung to him, feeling his solidity, his real presence beneath the layers of frozen clothes. Silas embraced her with his free arm, while continuing to lean on the improvised cane with the other. "The lamp," he murmured against her hair. "I saw it from the hill, it guided me home." Together they slowly returned to the house, she supporting part of his weight as he limped beside her. Once inside, by the fire, Eleanor could see the magnitude of his condition. His left arm was crudely bandaged, and beneath his clothes more bandages showed. His face showed new lines of pain and weariness, but his eyes, looking at her, contained the same light she remembered. "The telegram said there were gunshots," she said, as she helped him remove the layers of wet clothing. Silas nodded, allowing himself to be tended to with an unusual docility in him, a sign of his exhaustion. "James died 2 days before I arrived," he explained in a hoarse voice. His younger brother, Edmund, was devastated. He had been drinking for days. When I arrived at the tavern where he was staying, he was so drunk, he barely remembered having sent me the telegram. He paused as Eleanor offered him a cup of hot coffee. That night, Edmund got into a fight. He pulled out a revolver. I tried to stop him and he vaguely indicated his side. "The bullet grazed me. Nothing serious, but I lost quite a bit of blood." Eleanor listened in silence, helping him settle into the armchair by the fire. "I spent a week recovering," Silas continued. "By then the snow had already closed the mountain passes. The doctor said it was madness to try to return, but—" His eyes met hers. "I had made a promise." Eleanor felt something breaking and simultaneously recomposing inside her chest. The image of Silas, advancing on foot through snowy roads, wounded, determined to return to her against all odds, was almost too much to bear. "I left the horse at the last outpost," he continued. "The snow was too deep. I've been walking for 4 days. You could have died," she finally said, her hands busy changing the improvised bandages for clean ones. "I could have," Silas acknowledged, "but I didn't." The simplicity of his response contained the entire philosophy of a man who had learned to live one day at a time, facing each obstacle as it came, without dramatics or self-pity. "Besides," he added, his rough hand seeking hers, "I had something to bring you from the north." With careful movements, he extracted from his pocket a small object wrapped in cloth. Upon unwrapping it, Eleanor discovered a silver pendant in the shape of a tree, its branches extended like arms that embrace. "I found it in a store in Silverdale," Silas explained. "It reminded me of our name, Deep Roots." Eleanor held the pendant against the firelight, seeing how the silver captured and reflected the flames. It was beautiful in its simplicity, in its perfect symbolism. "I like to think Silas continued, his voice softening, that our child will carry this name, this idea beyond us, that their roots will be deep because we planted them well. Eleanor didn't respond with words. Instead, she took Silas's hand and placed it on her belly, just in time for him to feel a decided kick from within. The smile that illuminated Silas's exhausted face was all the confirmation she needed. He had found his way back not only to a place, but to a future they were both building. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, isolating deep roots from the rest of the world. But inside, by the fire, Eleanor and Silas had created their own universe, a refuge against the storms that life might send. Chapter Dex. The Shelter. The winter of 1874 entered Montana's annals as one of the most severe ever recorded. For weeks, snow fell with such intensity that communications between settlements were completely interrupted. At deep roots, life retreated inward toward the warmth of the fireplace and shared spaces. Silas's wound healed slowly. During the first days after his return, he could barely move without help, and Eleanor found herself in the role of nurse as well as expectant mother. She washed and changed bandages, prepared poultices to reduce inflammation, and watched over his troubled sleep when fever plagued him at night. "You're not used to being cared for, are you?" she asked him one afternoon as she helped him sit by the fire. Silas, whose face was beginning to regain some color, sketched a crooked smile. "The last person who cared for me was my mother, and that was more than 30 years ago." There was, in his tone, a lightness that Eleanor had learned to value. Silas's capacity to find humor, even in the most difficult circumstances, without self-pity or bitterness. As January gave way to February, Silas regained his strength. He could now move around the house without help, though the limp persisted, a reminder of his journey through the snow. Eleanor, for her part, entered her 8th month of pregnancy with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Her body, always strong and resilient, seemed to have adapted well to pregnancy, but the memories of her previous losses were never far from her mind. On a particularly cold night, as the storm lashed the windows with icy fingers, Eleanor found Silas in the room. They had begun to prepare for the baby. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by tools and pieces of wood, working on what would clearly be a cradle. "It should have been ready weeks ago," he said upon seeing her at the door. "But my hands still don't have all their strength." Eleanor approached, observing the half-built furniture. The wood was polished to perfect smoothness, and on the headboard Silas had carved a design of intertwined leaves and branches. "It's beautiful," she said, touching the carving with her fingertips. "Like everything you make with your hands." Silas looked at her from his position on the floor, and in his eyes Eleanor saw a gleam she knew well, the craftsman's satisfaction, with his work mixed with something deeper, more personal. "I never got to build one for my first son," he confessed, returning to his work. "I was at the front when he was born. When I returned, he was already sleeping in a small bed." The revelation shared with apparent calm as his hands continued working. "The wood," shook Eleanor. It was rare for Silas to speak of his previous life, of the son he had lost not through death but through circumstances. "What was his name?" she asked, carefully sitting in the rocking chair they had placed in the room. Silas continued working for a moment before responding. "William," he said finally, "like my father, though everyone called him Will." "How old was he when—" "3 when I left for war." "7 when I returned." Silas's voice was even, controlled. "Old enough to vaguely remember me, but not enough to understand why I couldn't claim to be his father." Eleanor kept silent, respecting the weight of those memories. Outside, the wind howled with renewed intensity, underscoring the intimacy of the shared moment. "I wrote him letters," Silas continued, surprising her. "For years after I left. Letters I never sent, of course. About things I saw in my travels, lessons I wanted to teach him. I kept them in a tin box." "What happened to them?" Eleanor asked softly. "I buried them in the mountains of Colorado 2 years ago," he responded. And for the first time his voice betrayed a deeper emotion. "I realized I was no longer writing for a child, but for myself. Will would already be a man by then. A man who never really knew me. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Eleanor understood that Silas was offering her not only a fragment of his past, but also a window to his present fears. The fear that history might repeat itself, that this new child, like the first, might somehow be taken from him. "This child will know you," she said firmly. "Will know your hands, your voice, the stories that only you can tell." Silas looked up from his work, and Eleanor saw in his eyes a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "What if I'm not what it needs?" he asked quietly. "It's been many years since I held a baby. I've seen too much. I've done—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Eleanor understood. War leaves invisible marks, scars that go beyond flesh. Children don't need perfect parents, she responded, remembering her own father, a quiet but constant man. They need present parents, who stay, who try, who love imperfectly but with all their being. She rose from the rocking chair and knelt beside him, with the difficulty characteristic of her advanced state. She took his hands, rough and calloused, stained by years of work and marked by old scars. "These hands have known violence, yes," she said, caressing his palms with her thumbs, "but they have also created beauty. They have built our home. They have carved figures that seem to breathe. They have held mine when I needed it most." Silas briefly closed his eyes, as if absorbing her words, allowing them to penetrate layers of doubt accumulated over years. "If our child inherits even a part of your strength, of your capacity to survive and start anew," Eleanor continued, "they will be more fortunate than most." The baby chose that moment to move vigorously, as if to underscore her words. Silas smiled, placing a hand on Eleanor's belly. "It has your temperament," he commented, "determined, impatient." Eleanor laughed, grateful for the shift toward a lighter tone, "and your tendency to appear at the most unexpected moments." They remained like that for a moment, connected by the movement of the new life they had created together. Then, with renewed determination, Silas returned to his work on the cradle. "It will be ready before he is," he promised. Eleanor didn't correct his use of the masculine pronoun. Silas seemed convinced they were expecting a boy, and she saw no reason to argue. Somehow it seemed appropriate, a new beginning, an opportunity for Silas to be the father that circumstances had prevented him from being before. That night, as the storm continued to lash the exterior, Eleanor wrote in the journal she had begun to keep for the baby. She didn't write about the fears or difficulties, but about the sound of wood being worked by loving hands, about the golden lamplight illuminating Silas's concentrated face, about the feeling of finally being exactly where she should be. "Your father builds your cradle with the same hands that have traversed half a continent," she wrote. "Hands that know the weight of weapons, but prefer that of tools. When you are born, these hands will hold you with a gentleness that would surprise you if you knew their strength. That's how your father is. A man capable of crossing storms to reach home, but who stops to carve a bird because he believes its mother needs company." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, in the warm shelter of deep roots, life continued its patient labor of weaving new beginnings from old threads. Chapter 15. The dawn of March winter began to loosen its grip on Montana with the arrival of March. The days perceptibly lengthened, and although snow still covered much of the terrain, the occasional sun melted patches here and there, revealing the dormant promise of the earth. At Deep Roots, Eleanor felt that her body followed a rhythm similar to that of the season. Something within her was preparing to emerge, to break the stillness of waiting. Her pregnancy had entered the final stretch. The doctor from Rivers Bend, who had finally been able to reach the farm when the roads were partially cleared, had confirmed that everything seemed to be developing normally. "For a first-time mother of your age," he had added with that particular tact of men of science, "you are surprisingly healthy." Eleanor had not corrected his assumption that it was her first pregnancy. The 3 previous ones, which had never reached term, belonged to a different life, to a woman who was no longer completely her. On a particularly luminous morning, Eleanor was on the porch, enjoying the pale sun that was beginning to warm the air. Her ADV, answered state limited her movements, but she refused to remain confined to the house. From her position, she could see Silas working in the corral, preparing the ground for the cattle that would soon be able to graze in the open air again, his limp, had improved considerably, though on cold mornings there was still a certain stiffness in his gait. Eleanor watched him move with that economy of gestures that characterized him, not wasting energy, each movement calculated and precise. There was something comforting in the routine they had established, in the way their lives had intertwined, to create a pattern that was new but familiar. The sound of hooves approaching on the road interrupted her thoughts. Turning with the slowness imposed by her volume, Eleanor saw Abigail Stokes approaching in her small cart. "Eleanor," the storekeeper greeted, stopping the vehicle in front of the house. "How wonderful to see you up and in the sun." "Winter has been too long to waste a day like this," Eleanor responded, smiling at her friend. Abigail descended agilely from the cart, loaded with several packages. "I've brought you some things from town," she explained, handing her a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Cloth for diapers, a blanket knitted by Mrs. Peterson, and—" She lowered her voice confidentially. "Something special from me." Eleanor unwrapped the package to find, beneath the cloth and blanket, a small carved wooden box. Upon opening it, she discovered a delicate silver bracelet with small charms, a leaf, a star, a bird. "Abigail, it's beautiful," she exclaimed, genuinely surprised by the gift. "It was my mother's," the storekeeper explained. "I wore it during the birth of my 3 children. It said that silver attracts good fortune and drives away evil spirits during childbirth." Eleanor caressed the small charms, moved by the gesture. Abigail's friendship, developed especially since Silas's arrival in her life, had been one of the unexpected gifts of recent months. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, struggling against the emotion that seemed to stalk her constantly these days. "Say you'll wear it," Abigail responded with simplicity, "and that you'll allow me to be with you when the time comes. I've assisted in more births than I can count." Eleanor nodded, grateful not only for the gift, but for the implicit offer of support. In frontier communities like Riversbend, births were women's affairs, moments when bonds of female solidarity were woven that transcended social or personal differences. Silas approached from the corral, removing his hat upon seeing the visitor. "Mrs. Stokes," he greeted with that slightly awkward formality he reserved for social interactions. "Welcome to Deep Roots. Mr. Boone," Abigail responded with a nod. "I see your leg has improved considerably." "Enough to be useful," he responded with a half-smile. Eleanor observed the exchange with some amusement. Silas and Abigail had developed a mutual respect based on the frankness and absence of pretense in both. "I've brought this for you too," said Abigail, handing him an envelope. "It arrived at the store 2 days ago, but with the thaw the roads are worse than with the snow." Silas took the envelope, examining the handwriting on the front with an indecipherable expression. "Thank you," he said simply, putting it in his shirt pocket without opening it. Eleanor noticed the gesture but didn't ask. She had learned to respect Silas's rhythms, his occasional need to process certain things privately before sharing them. Abigail stayed for lunch, bringing news from the town that seemed to be slowly awakening from its winter lethargy. Judge Wainwright had fallen ill, with pneumonia that kept him bedridden. Reverend Williams was planning a special celebration for Easter, the first major community gathering since before the storms. The school would reopen its doors the following week. "You should come for Easter," Abigail suggested, as Eleanor served coffee. "It would be good for the town to see that you're well, especially in your condition." Eleanor looked at Silas, leaving the decision in his hands. Social gatherings had never been his forte, but since the hearing in the church and their subsequent improvised wedding, their relationship with the community had improved notably. "If the weather permits and Eleanor feels up to it," he finally responded, "we'll be there." When Abigail left, promising to return soon, Eleanor found Silas on the back porch, contemplating the envelope he had received. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the fields, and in the distance, the first green shoots were beginning to appear between patches of melted snow. "Bad news?" she asked, unconsciously repeating the question she had asked him months ago when the telegram arrived, calling him north. Silas shook his head. "It's from Catherine," he said finally, "my brother's wife." Eleanor sat beside him, waiting. Silas had never mentioned having a living brother. "I didn't know you had living family," she commented softly. "My brother Robert died at Chancellorsville." In 63, Silas explained, his voice neutral. Catherine was left a widow with 2 small daughters. I wrote to her when I left my old life behind. She's the only person who knew I was still alive. He finally opened the envelope and extracted several pages covered in a delicate but firm handwriting. He read them in silence, his expression gradually softening. "The girls are well," he said finally. "Elizabeth is 12 now, Mary 10. Catherine says Elizabeth plays the piano with a talent that surpasses her teachers." There was evident pride in his voice, the kind of pride that only an uncle can feel for nieces he genuinely appreciates. "Where do they live?" Eleanor asked. "In Pennsylvania." "In the same town where Robert and I grew up." Silas paused, as if considering something. "I wrote to her 2 months ago, telling her about you, about us, about the baby." Eleanor felt a warmth expanding in her chest at the idea that Silas had shared his new life, that he had included her in that precarious network of family connections he still maintained. "Catherine says she would like to meet you someday," he continued, passing her the letter. "She says she always knew I would find my way back to happiness, even though I didn't believe it possible." Eleanor read the letter, moved by Catherine's warm and genuine tone, by the way she spoke of Silas with evident affection, as if she truly considered him family, despite the years of separation. "We should invite her to visit us," she suggested, "her and the girls, when the baby is a bit older and travel is safer." Silas looked at her with an expression Eleanor had learned to recognize, surprise mixed with gratitude, as if each gesture of inclusion, of acceptance of his past, was an unexpected gift. "I would like that," he admitted, "and I think Catherine would love Montana. She was always a woman of adventurous spirit, even more so than Robert." They stayed on the porch until the sun began to set, talking of future possibilities, of visits, and reunions, of the extended family their son or daughter might someday know. Eleanor felt that something new was taking shape between them, the ability to imagine not only a shared present, but also a future that extended beyond deep roots, that included people and places she did not yet know. When they finally entered the house, driven by the growing cold of evening, Eleanor felt a dull pain in her lower back. It wasn't the first time in recent days, and she attributed it to fatigue and her increasingly compromised posture. The baby seemed to have settled lower, as if preparing for the final journey. That night, as she prepared dinner, Eleanor found Silas sitting at the kitchen table, writing with concentration on a paper. "A response for Catherine?" she asked, placing plates on the table. Silas shook his head, continuing his writing for a moment more before stopping. "It's a letter for our child," he explained, his voice unusually soft. "I thought about what I told you about the letters I wrote for Will and never sent. I don't want to repeat that mistake." He set down the pen and looked at Eleanor with that mixture of vulnerability and determination she had come to associate with his most authentic moments. "I want our child to know who I am in my own words, not just who I am now, but also who I was. The mistakes I made, the things I learned, so that when they're older and they look at me, they see a complete man, not just a father." Eleanor sat across from him, deeply moved by the gesture. There was in this initiative a stronger commitment than any verbal promise. Silas was planting seeds for a future that extended far beyond the immediate present. "It's a precious gift," she said finally, "one they will be able to treasure all their life." Silas picked up the pen again, but before continuing he added, "I intend to write many, one for each birthday perhaps, for them to read when they're older and can understand them." That night, as the waxing moon gently illuminated the room, Eleanor awoke with a strange sensation. It wasn't exactly pain, but a tension, a pressure that came and went like waves against the shore. She carefully sat up, trying not to wake Silas, who slept beside her. She breathed deeply, counting the seconds between one sensation and the next. Too soon, she thought. There were at least 2 weeks left, according to the doctor's calculations. But her body seemed to have other plans. When the third wave of tension arrived, stronger than the previous ones, Eleanor knew with certainty that the time of waiting had ended. The child of deep roots had decided that March, with its promise of renewal, was the perfect moment to arrive in the world. Chapter 12. The Song of Life Dawn, found Eleanor in full labor. The contractions, initially spaced and manageable, had intensified with the relentless regularity of a clock. Silas, after the initial shock, had ridden to town in search of Abigail Stokes and the doctor, leaving Eleanor with the promise to return as soon as possible. "I can stay," he had insisted, clearly torn between the need to seek help and the fear of leaving her alone. "Go," Eleanor had responded with a calmness that surprised them both. "The first baby is never in a hurry. Return with Abigail." Now alone in the room, they had meticulously prepared for this moment. Eleanor walked slowly between contractions, stopping to hold onto the furniture when the pain intensified. She had brought water, clean towels, the special sheets she had reserved for the occasion. Everything was arranged with the practical efficiency that characterized her. And yet, as the sun began to illuminate the room with its golden light, Eleanor could not prevent fear from filtering through the cracks of her determination. The memories of her previous losses emerged like shadows: the blood, the empty pain, the sense of failure that no word of comfort had been able to completely dispel. "This time is different," she told herself aloud like a spell against fear. "This time I'm not alone." She stopped by the window, resting her forehead against the cold glass as another contraction built its growing wave of pain. In the distance, she could see the first green shoots in the fields, the promise of rebirth that each spring brought with it. The earth itself seemed to be exhaling new life, and Eleanor felt a primordial connection to that ancestral rhythm, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that she herself was experiencing in her body. When the contractions subsided, she breathed deeply and directed her gaze to the mantel where the objects that had acquired meaning during the past months rested: the carved bird, the figure of the pregnant woman, the tree-shaped pendant she now wore around her neck. Tangible symbols of the life she had built with Silas, anchors in the midst of the physical storm she was traversing. The silver bracelet that Abigail had given her tinkled softly on her wrist with each movement. Eleanor touched it, finding comfort in the idea that other women before her had crossed this same valley of pain, to emerge on the other side with a child in arms. Time acquired a strange quality, expanding and contracting like her own body. The contractions became more intense, closer together. Eleanor began to lose her sense of the outside world, focusing exclusively on the battle being waged within her. Each breath became a small but significant victory. Each moment between contractions, a gift to treasure. It was during a particularly brief pause when she heard horses' hooves approaching. Minutes later, the door of the house opened, and familiar voices filled the space. Silas, Abigail, and the deeper voice of Dr. Mitchell. "Eleanor," Silas called, his voice tense with worry. "Up here," she responded, surprised at how weak her own voice sounded. The hurried steps on the stairs preceded Abigail's entry into the room, followed by Silas and the doctor. The expression of relief on her husband's face almost made Eleanor smile, despite the pain that was beginning to build again. "Just in time," she managed to say before the next contraction forced her to double over, clutching the edge of the bed. What followed was a whirlwind of efficient activity. Abigail, whose experience in births was evident in every gesture, organized the room according to her needs. Dr. Mitchell examined Eleanor with compassionate professionalism, confirming that everything was progressing normally. Silas, initially uncomfortable in a space traditionally reserved for women, found his place beside Eleanor, holding her hand and offering his silent strength. "It's more advanced than I thought," the doctor commented after his examination. "This baby is in a hurry to meet the world." Abigail placed damp cloths on Eleanor's forehead and offered her small sips of water between contractions. Her calm and competent presence was like a balm amid the chaos of sensations. "You're doing wonderfully," she assured her. "Breathe with me like this, deep and slow." The hours merged into a continuum of pain and brief respites. Eleanor floated between states of consciousness, anchored only by the constant pressure of Silas's hand in hers and Abigail's calm voice guiding her. At some point, when the sun had already reached its zenith, Dr. Mitchell announced that the final moment had arrived. "With the next contraction, Eleanor, I want you to push with all your strength," he instructed, positioning himself. Eleanor gathered the last reserves of energy she had left. The pain was absolute now, consuming every fiber of her being. But alongside the pain was something else, a fierce determination, an instinct older than civilization itself. "You can do it, Eleanor." Silas's voice in her ear was firm, unshakable. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." When the contraction came, Eleanor immersed herself in it, like in a giant wave, letting it carry her, pushing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. A primitive cry escaped her throat, mixing with the doctor's instructions and Abigail's encouragement. And then, in a moment of perfect clarity amid the chaos, Eleanor felt how something changed, how a pressure suddenly yielded, and the entire world seemed to stop for an eternal instant. The cry, sharp and vigorous, broke the silence that had fallen over the room. A new sound in the world, the first declaration of a life just begun. "It's a girl," announced Dr. Mitchell, his professional voice betrayed by a note of emotion. "A perfectly healthy girl." Eleanor could barely focus her sight through the tears that flooded her eyes. Through the mist, she saw how the doctor placed a small bundle on her chest, a warm and pulsating weight that seemed to immediately find its place, as if it had always been destined to rest there. "Our daughter," she whispered, her trembling hands discovering the tiny wrinkled face, the clenched fists, the dark hair stuck to the little head. Beside her, Silas seemed to have been left speechless. His eyes, fixed on the newborn, contained an indescribable mixture of awe, fear, and love so pure that Eleanor felt her heart might burst just witnessing it. "She is," he began, but words seemed insufficient. Instead of speaking, he extended a finger that the baby immediately grabbed with her tiny hand, a reflex gesture that nevertheless seemed to seal a pact between them. Abigail, with the efficiency born of experience, helped clean the baby and Eleanor, moving discreetly to give them space while Dr. Mitchell completed the necessary procedures. Soon the room was in relative calm, illuminated by the afternoon light that filtered through the curtains. "What will you name her?" asked Abigail, as she wrapped the little one in the blanket she had specially knitted for her. Eleanor looked at Silas, a silent question in her eyes. They had discussed names during the winter, but had never reached a final decision. "Grace," said Silas with a certainty that surprised Eleanor. "Grace Boone." The name floated in the air of the room, and Eleanor immediately knew it was perfect. Grace, Grace, the unmerited gift, the beauty that emerges from the unexpected, like the life they had built together, like the love that had flourished among the ruins of their individual pasts. "Grace," she repeated, savoring the sound. "I like it." Abigail placed the baby in Eleanor's arms again, now clean and tightly wrapped. "Welcome to the world, Grace Boone," said the storekeeper with a smile. "You've chosen exceptional parents." When they were finally alone, Silas sat on the edge of the bed, contemplating his wife and daughter with an expression Eleanor had never seen before on him, a complete peace, as if all the scattered pieces of his life had finally found their place. "When I was in the war," he said quietly, "I saw men pray before battles. I never did. I couldn't find the words, or perhaps I didn't believe there was anyone listening." He paused, his eyes fixed on little Grace, who slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "But today, riding to town, I prayed for the first time in my life, not with words, but with my whole being. And now I understand why men pray, because there are things in this world too big, too important to face with just our own strength." Eleanor extended her free hand toward him, and Silas took it, intertwining his fingers with hers. "We are not alone," she said simply. And as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, bathing the room in a golden light, the three remained united in that perfect moment, a newly formed family, intertwined roots that extended deeply into the Montana earth. Chapter 3. The circles of time summer arrived in Montana in an explosion of color and life. The fields around Deep Roots undulated with green grass and wildflowers, and the apple trees that Silas and Jenna had planted showed promising growth. Life on the farm had found a new rhythm, dictated largely by the needs of little Grace, who at 3 months of age flourished with the vitality characteristic of frontier children. Eleanor found herself, that morning on the front porch, gently rocking Grace while watching Silas work in the fields. The child, awake and alert, followed with her large dark eyes. Her father's eyes, Eleanor thought, the movement of leaves in the nearby trees, fascinated by this constantly moving world she was just beginning to discover. "Someday, all this will be yours," Eleanor murmured, caressing her daughter's perfect cheek. "This land, these trees, this sky, a better inheritance than gold or silver." Grace responded with a cheerful gurgle, one of those pure sounds that seemed to contain all. The joy of the universe in a few notes. Eleanor smiled, still marveling at how this small creature had transformed her life, had filled spaces she didn't know were empty. The first months of motherhood had not been easy. Nights of interrupted sleep, the pronounced learning curve of breastfeeding, moments of uncertainty and fear with each small setback. But they had also been months of discovery and wonder. Grace's first real smile, the moment she seemed to recognize her parents, the way her little hands clung to Silas's, fingers with surprising strength for someone so tiny. And perhaps most surprising for Eleanor had been observing Silas's transformation. The man who had once wandered aimlessly across the country, carrying the weight of his past like a penance, now seemed anchored, present in a way that was almost tangible. Silas had assumed fatherhood with the same methodical dedication he applied to everything. But there was something more, a tenderness, an infinite patience that emerged especially during difficult nights, when he paced with Grace around the room for hours, whispering stories that only they two shared. A cart appeared on the road leading to the farm, interrupting Eleanor's reflections. She immediately recognized Judge Wainwright's vehicle and felt a pang of apprehension. Since Grace's birth, the judge had shown a surprisingly cordial attitude toward the Boones, even sending a small gift for the baby. But Eleanor still remembered his initial hostility too well to feel completely comfortable in his presence. "Silas," she called, loudly enough for her husband to hear her from the field. "Judge Wainwright is coming to visit." Silas looked up from his work, nodding briefly before heading toward the house. By the time the cart stopped in front of the porch, both were there to receive the visitor. "Judge Wainwright," Eleanor greeted, adjusting Grace in her arms. "What a surprise to see you here." The judge, thinner after his winter illness but with the same erect posture as always, laboriously descended from the cart. "Mrs. Boone, Mr. Boone," he greeted formally, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Not at all," Silas responded, extending a hand that the judge briefly shook. "Would you like to come in? Eleanor has just made fresh lemonade." The judge accepted the invitation with a nod, and soon the three found themselves seated in the main room of the house, with Grace observing the visitor with open curiosity from Eleanor's lap. "She's a beautiful child," the judge commented, showing an unexpected softness in his tone. "She resembles you, Mrs. Boone. She has your forehead and your chin." "And her father's eyes," Eleanor added with a smile, exchanging a complicit look with Silas. The judge took a sip of lemonade before clearing his throat, as if preparing to address the real purpose of his visit. "I've come to speak to you about an official matter," he said finally. "As you know, the town is growing. The railroad will arrive next year, and with it, new settlers, commerce, opportunities, and challenges." He paused, evaluating the reaction of his hosts. "The town council has decided that we need to expand our local government structure. Specifically, we are establishing a committee on land and water rights to handle the inevitable disputes that will arise with expansion." Eleanor looked at Silas, intrigued by the direction the conversation was taking. "I would like to appoint you, Mr. Boone, as a member of this committee," the judge continued, addressing Silas. "Your experience in different parts of the country, your practical knowledge of the land, and your," he seemed to search for the right word, "sense of justice would be valuable." The silence that followed this proposal was loaded with meaning. Eleanor understood what it represented, not just an official recognition of Silas's place in the community, but also an olive branch extended by the very man who had once tried to expel them. Silas, for his part, seemed genuinely surprised by the proposal. His gaze turned toward the window, toward the fields they had worked with such effort, as if seeking the answer in the land itself. "It's an honor, Judge," he said finally. "But I'm not a man of committees and meetings." The judge nodded as if expecting this response. "I understand, however, I ask you to consider it," he continued. "The decisions this committee makes will affect all families in the valley, including yours. It would be beneficial to have a voice, representing small landowners, not just railroad interests and large ranches. Eleanor saw how Silas processed this argument. If there was anything her husband valued, it was practical justice, especially for those with less power or influence. "I'll think about it," he finally conceded, "and I'll give you my answer next week." The judge seemed satisfied with this commitment. The conversation drifted to lighter topics: the promising harvest, plans for the Independence Day celebration in town, the progress of the newly planted apple trees. By the time the judge said goodbye, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, tinting the fields with gold and crimson. That night, after putting Grace to bed in the cradle Silas had built with such care, Eleanor found her husband on the back porch, contemplating the stars that were beginning to appear in the twilight sky. "What do you think of the judge's proposal?" she asked, sitting beside him. Silas remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains were silhouetted against the increasingly dark sky. "I've never seen myself as part of committees or governments," he finally responded. "I've spent most of my adult life avoiding precisely that kind of commitment." Eleanor nodded, waiting. She knew Silas well enough to know there was more to his thoughts. "But now I have a daughter," he continued, his voice softening. "And I wonder what world she will inherit, what kind of community will grow around her." He turned to Eleanor, and in the growing darkness she could see the seriousness in his gaze. "When I came here, I did so seeking justice for you. Perhaps now I should seek it for all who, like us, simply want a place to put down roots." Eleanor took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I think you would be an important voice on that committee," she said sincerely. "A voice for those who normally don't have one." Silas gently squeezed her hand, silently thanking her for her support. "Besides," Eleanor added with a smile, "it's time Judge Wainwright had someone to stand up to him in his meetings." This drew a brief laugh from Silas, one of those rare and precious sounds that Eleanor treasured. Summer advanced, and with it, the sense that the circles of time were completing and beginning again. Eleanor often thought about how her life had changed in just a year, from the solitary widow who buried her husband with her own hands to the mother and wife who contemplated a future full of possibilities. It wasn't a change she had sought or planned, but one that had arrived like the seasons, inevitable, transformative, necessary. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Grace slept her nap, Eleanor decided to do something she had postponed for months. She took from the trunk in her room an old leather notebook, a gift from Charles in their early years together. She had used it as a diary for a time, but had stopped writing after her first pregnancy loss, as if the words had dried up along with her tears. Now seated at the kitchen table, she opened the notebook to a blank page and began to write. Not about the past, nor about the pain that had once defined her existence, but about the present, about Grace and her daily discoveries, about Silas and his slow but steady integration into the community, about the farm and how it flourished under their joint care. She wrote about Silas's decision to accept the appointment to the land committee, about Judge Wainwright's surprised but pleased reaction, about the first time Grace had rolled over by herself, the expression of amazement on her small face upon discovering this new skill, about the plans they were making to expand the house next year, adding an additional room and perhaps a dedicated space for Silas to work on his carvings. She wrote until the light changed, announcing sunset. When she finally set down the pen, Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction, as if she had completed an important circle. The act of documenting her present life was a way of honoring both the past and the future, of recognizing that each moment, even the seemingly trivial ones, formed part of a larger story. She stored the notebook not in the trunk, but in the drawer of the nightstand, where she could easily access it. She promised herself to write regularly, to create a record of these precious days that Grace could read someday, to know not only the events of her childhood, but also her mother's thoughts and feelings. When Silas returned from town that afternoon, bringing news of the committee and a small wooden toy for Grace that he had bought at Abigail's store, Eleanor received him with a new serenity. There was something powerful in the act of reclaiming her own narrative, of putting into words the life they were building together. A good day, Silas asked, noticing something different in her expression. Eleanor smiled, taking Grace from his arms so he could remove his dusty boots. "A day to remember," she responded simply. And as the sun set over Montana, bathing deep roots in a golden light that seemed to bless every blade of grass, every wooden plank, every living being that inhabited the property, Eleanor thought of the circles of time, how they ended and began again, how loss gave way to encounter, how winter always inevitably yielded to spring. Chapter 14. The Memory. Tree autumn had arrived again in Montana, bringing with it a symphony of colors that transformed the landscape into a vibrant canvas. A full year had passed since Silas Boone appeared at the auction, changing the course of Eleanor's life with a few decisive words and a wad of worn bills. It was Sunday, and the Boone family was preparing to attend the service at the small church in Riversbend. Grace, now 6 months old, sat on the marriage bed watching attentively as her mother arranged her hair in front of the mirror. The child had grown quickly, already showing the innate curiosity and silent determination that characterized both parents. "Your new dress suits you beautifully," Silas commented, entering the room already dressed in his Sunday suit, the only one he owned and which he reserved exclusively for special occasions. Eleanor turned, smiling to see her husband so formally dressed. He still seemed slightly uncomfortable in elegant clothes, as if his body better remembered the weight of tools than of suits. "And you look every bit a respectable committee member," she responded, slightly adjusting his tie. "Judge Wainwright will be impressed." Silas made a face that pretended to be disgust, but failed to hide the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. His appointment to the land committee had proven to be more significant than either of them had anticipated. In the months that had passed, he had earned the respect even of those who had initially questioned his suitability, consistently defending the rights of small landowners against more powerful interests. "The judge and I have reached an understanding," he said, lifting Grace in his arms. "He pretends it doesn't bother him when I question his proposals, and I pretend not to notice how the vein in his forehead throbs when I do." Eleanor laughed, gathering the last items needed for the family outing. The relationship between Silas and Judge Wainwright had gradually transformed into something that, if not exactly friendship, could at least be described as mutual respect. The tacit recognition of two men who, despite their differences, shared a genuine concern for the future of their community. The journey to town took place in the cart that Silas had completely renovated during the summer. Grace, seated on Eleanor's lap, observed the changing landscape with wondering eyes, occasionally pointing to birds or animals with inarticulate enthusiasm. Riversbend had grown in the past year. New constructions dotted the main street, and the bustle of activity was notably greater than before. The imminent arrival of the railroad had attracted merchants and settlers, transforming the sleepy town into an increasingly vibrant center. As they approached the church, Eleanor noticed an unusually large group gathered outside. It seemed the entire town was present, and the atmosphere had an expectant quality, as if something special was about to happen. "What's going on?" she asked Silas, who seemed as bewildered as she was. Before he could respond, Abigail Stokes approached their cart, her face illuminated by a mysterious smile. "You arrived just in time," she exclaimed. "The Reverend is about to begin the special ceremony." "Ceremony?" Eleanor asked, confused. "What ceremony?" Abigail exchanged a look with Silas that immediately aroused Eleanor's suspicions. There was complicity in that exchange, a shared secret. "It's better that you come and see for yourselves," Abigail responded, extending her arms to take Grace. "May I take her for a moment? The Reverend wants to speak with you two alone." Intrigued and slightly alarmed, Eleanor descended from the cart and followed Silas toward the back of the church, where Reverend Williams awaited them beside an object covered by a cloth. The clergyman greeted them with a warmth that had been absent in their first encounters, when he viewed their relationship with skepticism and disapproval. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone, thank you for coming," he said, shaking their hands. "We have something to show you before the service." With a ceremonious gesture, he removed the cloth to reveal a polished bronze plaque mounted on a carved wooden base. Eleanor approached to read the inscription. In memory of Charles Hartley and all those who built our town with their work and sacrifice, may their deep roots sustain the generations to come. Eleanor felt her breath catch. She looked at Silas, who observed the plaque with a solemn but serene expression. It was Silas's idea, the Reverend explained. He proposed to the council that we establish a memorial to honor the town's founders and those who left us too soon. Judge Wainwright strongly supported it, Silas added, his voice soft. And the wooden base, I carved it myself. Eleanor looked more closely at the base and recognized the motifs, intertwined branches, similar to those Silas had carved on Grace's cradle, symbols of continuity and renewal. After the service, we'll plant a young oak in the cemetery, the Reverend continued. The plaque will be placed next to it, a memory tree, so to speak. Eleanor couldn't contain the tears that came to her eyes. The gesture meant more than she could express in words. It not only honored Charles and his memory, but also recognized the continuity between her past and her present, the way all the pieces of her life intertwined to form a coherent whole. Thanks. You, she finally managed to say, her voice barely audible. It's perfect. Silas placed an arm around her shoulders, offering his silent support as she processed the emotion of the moment. It was one of those gestures that had come to define their relationship. Presence without invasion, shared strength without unnecessary words. The religious service proceeded in a state of heightened awareness for Eleanor. The Reverend's words, about spiritual renewal and growth, seemed especially resonant that day. Grace remained surprisingly calm in her arms, as if the little one perceived the importance of the moment. Afterward, the entire congregation moved to the cemetery for the planting of the oak. The day was perfect, an intensely blue sky, temperature, cool but not cold, and a gentle breeze that made the leaves of the surrounding trees whisper. Eleanor thought that Charles would have appreciated the beauty of the day, he who had always found comfort in the natural cycles of the earth. Judge Wainwright spoke a few words about the importance of honoring the past while building the future. Abigail read a poem about trees and memory. Then, in a symbolic gesture, the Reverend invited Eleanor to place the first shovelful of earth around the young oak, followed by Silas and then by other members of the community, each adding their contribution to this new living monument. When the ceremony concluded, many approached Eleanor to share memories of Charles, anecdotes she didn't know, small acts of kindness that had meant a lot to others. It was as if, by publicly honoring him, the community finally allowed itself to speak openly about him, integrating his memory into the collective history of the town. Later, when the official celebrations had ended and most of the attendees had dispersed, Eleanor returned to the cemetery alone. Grace had stayed with Silas, who instinctively understood her need for this private moment. She knelt beside Charles's grave, now adorned with fresh flowers brought by neighbors and friends. The headstone, eroded by a year of weather, seemed less austere under the golden afternoon light. "I hope you don't mind sharing this place with a tree," she said quietly, as if Charles could hear her. "I think you would have liked the idea. You always said you wanted to see something lasting grow in this land." The wind gently stirred the branches of the newly planted oak, producing a sound that Eleanor chose to interpret as approval. "We are happy, Charles," she continued, feeling the need to share this truth. "Not in the way we planned, but happy all the same. And part of that happiness we built together, you and I, during our shared years." She ran her fingers over the letters engraved on the headstone, tracing the name that had once been the centre of her existence. "Silas understands that better than anyone," she added. "He understands that love is not a limited resource, that I don't need to forget you to love him. I think that's why he did this memorial, so that everyone knows our stories are connected, that no life truly ends as long as someone remembers it." She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her dress. As she turned, she saw Silas waiting at a distance holding Grace. He had respected her privacy, but was there, present, available when she was ready to return. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, bathing the cemetery in a golden light that softened the contours of the headstones and highlighted the vitality of the young oak. Eleanor walked toward her family, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Ready to go home, Silas. asked when she joined them. Eleanor took Grace in her arms, feeling the comforting weight of her daughter, the warmth of her small body. "Yes," she responded with a genuine smile. "Let's go home." The road back to Deep Roots was bathed in the light of sunset, transforming the familiar landscape into something almost mythical. Eleanor thought of the circles of time, how a full year had passed since those dark days after Charles's death. A year of losses and findings, of endings and beginnings, of roots that deepened in the nurturing earth of Montana. Upon arriving at the property, Silas stopped the cart in front of the main entrance. There, a new carved wooden sign proclaimed the name of their home, Deep Roots, with intricate designs of branches and leaves framing the letters. "I finished it last night," Silas explained, watching her reaction. "I thought it was appropriate after all that has happened this year." Eleanor contemplated the sign, admiring the meticulous craftsmanship, the way it perfectly captured the essence of what they had built together. "It's beautiful," she said simply. That night, after putting Grace to bed, Eleanor and Silas sat on the porch as they had done so many times during the past year. The sky was clear, a mantle of bright stars that seemed within reach. In the distance, the contours of the mountains were silhouetted against the horizon, silent guardians of their little corner of the world. "You did something extraordinary today," Eleanor finally said, breaking the comfortable silence. "With the memorial, the tree. It was a gift to the entire community." Silas contemplated the horizon, his profile outlined against the night sky. "It was a gift for you," he responded with simplicity. "And for Grace, so she knows where she comes from, that her story began before us." Eleanor extended her hand, finding his with the familiarity of someone who has traveled this road many times. "When you came into my life," she said quietly, "I thought you were offering me a new beginning, but what you really offered was continuity, the possibility of carrying my past with me, not as a burden, but as part of who I am." Silas gently squeezed her hand, and in that simple gesture was contained all the understanding that words could not fully express. "We all carry our stories with us," he responded. "The important thing is not to let them completely define us, not to let them prevent us from writing new chapters." Eleanor thought of the notebook she now regularly filled, of the letters Silas wrote for Grace, of the newly planted tree that would grow for generations. Different ways of preserving memory, of weaving the past with the present and the future. "You know what I thought today, seeing the whole community gathered?" she asked, looking toward the stars. "That once a woman believed her story had ended when she buried her husband, but she discovered it wasn't so. She had barely reached the page, where she finally became the heroine of her own life." Silas smiled, recognizing her words as an echo of thoughts Eleanor had shared in the early days of their relationship. "And what a story she is writing," he responded, with a warmth that made Eleanor's heart expand in her chest. They remained like that, hand in hand under Montana's starry sky, two people who had found in each other not only love, but also redemption and purpose. In the house behind them, Grace slept peacefully, perhaps dreaming of the trees and mountains that would be the setting of her own story, yet to be written. And in town, a young oak extended its first roots in the cemetery soil, beginning a growth that would continue long after all those present at its planting had become part of the same earth. A living symbol of the truth that Eleanor and Silas had discovered together, that life, like trees, thrives best when its roots are deep, when it is nourished by both the past and the present, when it extends toward the future with hope and determination. At Deep Roots, under the protective mantle of the Montana night, a family rested, rooted and flourishing, prepared for whatever season the future might bring.